Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to MusicForever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the new self-titled record from Rammstein. I do want to give a little disclaimer before getting into this review that I do not speak or understand German. The reason I bring this up, of course, is because the band's lyrics, song titles, so on and so forth are in German. So as a result of that, it makes it a bit difficult to, pick apart the lyrics in the way I typically would. I'll get to that a bit more later on in the review, however. And as for the song titles themselves, if it seems like, I'm kind of dancing around saying the song titles here in this review, it's probably just because I don't want to butcher any of these song titles, because believe me, I would butcher them if I tried for the most part. So, yeah, I just wanted to get that out of the way before the actual review began. So, yeah, with that said, here's the actual start of the review. So I was really looking forward to this record overall, considering it's been nearly a decade since we got the last record from these guys. And in that time period, I believe I saw somewhere years back, a couple years at this point, I'm guessing, that the reason why the band hadn't really released a new album in so long was because they were waiting for, the best time, I guess you could say, for them to come together and make a new record. They were really waiting for the chemistry to be there in order to make an album that was going to be worth making, which was something that at least had me hopeful that for whenever this thing would eventually drop, it would be a good album and not just, an album that they were putting out to make some money or something like that. And after the long wait and after having heard this thing a good few times now, I could happily say that this thing was definitely worth the wait, because this is a overall pretty good album, I would say. I wouldn't say it's the band's best record or anything, however, I do think that this is a upper tier album from these guys overall. I think it does at times rival some of the best material that they dropped in the past. And considering that it's been, like I said, a 10-year gap between records, that's a really impressive thing to do. In terms of taking any big risks or anything quite like that here on this record, the band doesn't really try to do that for the most part. A lot of the times on this thing, the band sticks to what they have done best in their previous albums. And I think that this record is all the better for it, because in some ways it seems like they're really improving on this formula that they've already set out for themselves. And the fact that, like I said, it's been nearly 10 years since we last got a record from these guys, it makes hearing this new material from them, even if it is stylistically pretty similar to some of their older material, it still feels a bit new. It still feels somewhat fresh overall, despite the fact that had this thing dropped maybe closer to the release of their last album than now, I'm not sure it would feel exactly quite like that. I do want to make it clear, though, that there are some tracks on this thing that do try and succeed at pulling off some different sounds. Some sounds that are maybe a bit new to the band, but maybe are only explored briefly. Or maybe just some tracks that, while, maybe they're not super new sounding in the grand scheme of things or anything, are still really standout moments in the record for doing something a little bit different than what this album typically goes for. However, before you can get to some of the odder tracks later on in the track listing, the start of the album, of course, has some more straightforward, to-the-point tracks, some songs that feel really reminiscent of some of the stylings that the band has played around with in the past. However, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, as I feel like the start of this project really is the band kind of saying that, they're back, they're doing what they do best, and that this is going to be a good record overall. The opening track to this thing, which was also the lead single to this album, was a track that when I initially covered it in one of my track review videos, I said it was pretty good overall, however it was a bit typical. However, giving this thing more listens, especially in the context of the record, I can't help but like this track more than I did just as a single. I do still think that the track stylistically is pretty similar to stuff that the band has done in the past. However, like I alluded to before, I think that they're doing it, they're just performing this style really excellently here on this track. I love the really grand anthemic chorus that this track has going for it. It really just announces to the world that, the band is back and they're going to be doing great things, not just as, a lead single to this thing and the first taste that everyone really got of this album, but also as the first track on this album too. It really just announces to you when you're listening to this thing that Rammstein are back and they're making some great music here on this track. I also find the lyrics to this track to be pretty interesting too. Like I said earlier, I can't, read German or anything quite like that, so all my interpretations of these tracks are based on some translations I was able to come across online and interpretations I've already seen online and things like that, which, if you're like me, you might be a bit skeptical of those translations and interpretations. So I'll try to avoid any unnecessary analysis of these lyrics that maybe I don't understand too much. But for this first track on the record, the meaning behind this song is one that's pretty apparent, considering lots of people have really been dissecting this song since it was released. And I do, like I said, like the lyrics on this track quite a bit, as the band seems to be conflicted with being both prideful of their home country of Germany, but at the same time they dislike a lot of the baggage that kind of comes along with that, considering some of the pretty negative things that the country has done in the past as well. I think it's a really interesting song topic, and it's one that the band explores really nicely. And especially considering that, at least, I can't really speak for those in Germany, but at least here in the United States, when it comes to German rock bands, German metal bands, I feel like this group is probably one of the most well-known and famous, especially if you're considering bands that still, make music in their mother tongue. Rammstein are probably the most popular. So for them to make a song like this, which, kind of talks about their home country to some extent, I feel like, at least from the perspective of someone in the United States, it's a pretty cool idea overall. And as for the instrumental to this track, I really love the pounding guitars on this thing. I love the synth parts as well. Overall, it's pretty standard Rammstein, but they're doing their sound really excellently here, as I said before. And the same could be said for the next few tracks on the record. Radio that follows this one is one with another really monstrous hook that's just really catchy, some more really pounding, aggressive guitars, some more excellent synth parts worked into there as well. Another really typical song from them, but one that's executed really excellently overall, and another track that has grown on me since I first reviewed it in its track review, where I was talking about the single. Just another really solid cut from this thing. The third track from the album features some pretty cool sounding choir elements that are pulled into this thing. However, the majority of this track is just, once again, really straightforward, aggressive Rammstein with some really pounding guitars, just some really memorable hook work here on this thing too. Just another really solid cut from this thing. And the fourth track on the record is probably one of my, if not my favorite song on this thing. I really love some of the synth parts on this thing. I love how grand the track feels overall and how catchy it is. I do like how there are some moments on the song that kind of just move away a bit from the heavier moments and allow for some more melodic, catchy moments too. Overall, really cool song in my opinion. One of the catchiest on the record, one of the most interesting instrumentals on the record, and I really love the vibe that the band was going for with this song. As you move further into the album's runtime, the band begins to experiment a little bit more. They never really stray too far from their typical sound, however, they do so just enough to keep things really interesting. For example, on the sixth track on the album, this is one of the most interesting overall in my opinion, as it starts off a bit more quiet sounding. However, as the track moves along, you have some of the most aggressive and off-the-wall sounding vocals that you get on the entire album, and it just makes the track instantly stand out for that reason alone. I mean, just the passion and energy put into the performances here on this track are really some of the finest on the entire record. The seventh track on this thing sees the band playing into almost like a power ballad-like sound, I guess, would be the closest thing to describe it as, with a really catchy, emotional, over-the-top like hook that I think is pretty fantastic overall. The overall approach to this track is one that's less aggressive and in-your-face than a lot of the other songs here on this project. And while the band, in playing into this power ballad-like sound, aren't really doing a different sound that is super new to music or groundbreaking or anything quite like that, it's just different enough from the rest of the music on this project to really stand out in a really good way. And then the eighth track on the album is probably the most stripped back and calm sounding on the entire project, with lots of more acoustic instrumentation, just an overall softer performance. Another highlight, just once again, because it has a pretty different sound to it than a lot of what the album has to offer. However, if you dig into the track itself and what it has to offer on its own, it's still a really compelling and interesting song. The final three tracks on this record that close it out are, once again, some more typical songs for the band as opposed to some of the more experimental cuts you get towards the middle of the record. However, I still think that these are really solid songs overall. Despite the fact that they're really nothing new, I would say, they still have really strong vocal performances, some pretty catchy hooks in there as well, really great driving instrumentals too. Overall, just Rammstein doing what they do best for the most part, and leads to a really solid conclusion to this record. As for the lyrics on this album, I can't analyze them in the same way that I typically do, as I've mentioned several times already, because I don't speak German or understand it. However, if the translations and interpretations I've seen online are to be true, and maybe that's not the best way to go about analyzing songs, considering I can't confirm if they're true or not, some of the songs, at the very least, on this thing seem to have some pretty interesting lyrical topics to them. Outside of the first track that I already talked about, the second song on this thing has some pretty interesting lyrics too, talking about living in East Germany in the time of the Soviet Union, trying to listen to stuff that is banned by whatever means possible through a radio, for example. I'm not super familiar with this time period, especially when it comes to Germany, so I can't really dive too deeply into that just based on that as well. However, the song topic here is one that I haven't really encountered all that often, at least when it applied to something as specifically as this track is. So, yeah, it's definitely another standout lyrically, at least, to my knowledge and understanding. There are parts on this album that see the band exploring lyrical topics that they've covered before, or, at least generally to some extent, whether it be some of the creepier lyrics that appear on, say, the closing track to this thing, or track 6, or maybe some of the more sexual lyrics that pop up at various points on this album, most notably on the track Sex, who would guess, which is also probably my least favorite track on this thing. Not because it's a bad song or anything, I still think it's a decent track overall. It's just probably the most typical on the record overall, and because there's so many songs on this thing that do the typical Rammstein sound so much better, this one just kind of feels forgettable, I guess, compared to them. I will say the track does have a pretty catchy hook to it, and having them yell out sex as loudly as possible is somewhat entertaining, I will admit. But still, this track is just, kind of forgettable, I guess, in the context of the record. And when it comes to other complaints I do have with this project, I can't say that there's a whole ton of them, honestly. I mean, at times I do wish that maybe the band experimented maybe a little bit more on some of these tracks, but still, the fact that the band is doing their more normal sound, but just doing it so well on this thing, is, just something I really can't complain about at the end of the day, considering I do like the sound that the band has kind of formulated for themselves over the year, and especially considering the fact that it's been so long since we've gotten new material from these guys. This album isn't one that's going to convert non-fans into fans, but for fans of this group already, this is definitely an album that I think you'll at least get some enjoyment out of, because there are a lot of cuts on this thing that see the band doing with stuff that they've done in the past, doing their, typical sound, if you will, but just really excelling at it. And, it's not often that you get bands that do that. You have lots of bands out there that kind of stick to a formula, or maybe try to go back to their roots or something, but don't really pull it off, or just kind of sound redundant. Not the case with this record. This record is one of the exceptions out there, where the band is doing their more typical sound, if you will, but just really excelling at it, with, the really massive, catchy hooks on this thing, the really excellent, punchy, heavy-sounding instrumentation, the somewhat interesting lyrical topics they decide to explore on this thing, and also a pretty solid runtime on this thing as well. It doesn't overstay its welcome, but at the same time, it's not too short either, and it doesn't really feel like I'm getting cheated after 10 years of waiting when it comes to the runtime of this thing. So, yeah, I really like this album overall, if you couldn't tell already. Definitely recommend it to fans of the band, or just rock fans in general. This is definitely a pretty solid album to check out. Like I said, an upper tier album from these guys. Not one of their best necessarily, but still a pretty great release. So, yeah, that's all there really is for me to say on this project. If you enjoyed this video, I'd greatly appreciate if you leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, things like that. So if you enjoyed that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you also leave a comment down below sharing your thoughts on this project, considering everything here is just my own personal opinion. I greatly appreciate seeing your own input on this album and what you thought about it. And yeah, thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.